I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
From the gates of Mount Rome to the far corners of the endless highway, wherever you are, welcome to the show.
So you believe in some kind of Armageddon?
Yeah, most definitely. We in the last times and days right now. The Illuminati's in effect.
My guest today is a researcher and podcaster. He's the host of two podcasts, those being Inquiries of Our Reality and Bizarre Encounters. Shayn Jones, thanks for coming on, man.
Absolute pleasure to be on the show, man. After having a great conversation on my end, man, we had to switch it over to your end and have a good conversation.
Yeah, that was fun. I really enjoyed coming on your show. We got pretty deep into some World War II advanced technology and stuff like that. It was great.
Yeah, we even got to dive a little bit into like my alien theory stuff. And I know maybe at some point we'll kind of want to get into some weird theories and stuff on this one just because it was pretty fun last time. But yeah, the whole like alien abduction phenomenon not being just specifically aliens, but also having a faction of humans. So it was a fun conversation, man. Like anybody that didn't listen to it, highly recommend going back and listen to it, especially if you guys end up enjoying this episode.
Yeah, everybody go check that out. You told me at some point since we've met that you had a Michigan story. So I was thinking about that today, and I gotta say, you know, I just had a conversation recently. I had Jay Widener on, and we were talking about he was breaking this down. It was absolutely epic. He was talking about this ancient naval seafaring secret society, and he traced it back to the Phoenicians who were coming over here from the Middle East to mine copper from Lake Michigan. And I think that Phoenicians and Minoans and a couple other groups were coming over here to do this copper mining. But I just think that that area, I'm bringing this up because it's such a rich area with such a dense history. And in fact, there's a town up there on the Keweenaw Peninsula called Copper Harbor. And I just see that name as tracing back to an earlier age. You know, I think that there's a lot of town names in the States here that go back to this earlier age. But all that to say, that area, Michigan, has some extremely dense history.
Just to throw in another little aspect too, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, so I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, but I'll call it the layman's English name for it. But there's the water panther, which was like the top of the Upper Peninsula, kind of going into Lake Superior. There was this basically like a cave drawing essentially on the pictured rocks that had this depiction of this thing, and it was supposed to be like the protector of the copper. So in a weird way, like it seems like folklore usually ends up reflecting whatever's happening in that region. So considering people are coming over and stealing the copper, essentially mining the copper, it would make sense they end up having this water panther deity that they saw that protected the copper. And then in turn, I mean, passing those stories along, everybody's a little bit more like, oh, you know, what could possibly be out here because they're not familiar with the territory. So starting up some folklore just to keep people away, like it kind of brings in a new perspective to the water panther concept when you kind of look at it from that possible viewpoint, that it's created to protect the area. And, you know, it's kind of side tangent with it protects the copper, but like bringing a whole other facet into it, you know?
Yeah, I love that, man. I have not heard that before. That is incredible. I know there's a episode that I've been working on, and it's just kind of on the shelf right now. I'm going to put it out eventually, but it has to do with the Great Lakes area. It has to do with cults and sea monsters or lake monsters, I should say. And pointing back to the story you just told, there are petroglyphs and rock carvings of these sea monsters that the Native Americans etched. And it does have, there's a spiritual element to the lore where there's one story where there was a big storm on one of the lakes, and some of these Native Americans were caught out there on the storm. And one of these sea monsters, because they were in touch with the spiritual and sacred aspect of this creature, they were able to follow it to shore safely in the middle of the storm. So there's this like what you're saying, there's like a multifaceted sacred component to a lot of these cryptids. And I just really see it uh really shining in that area of Michigan and the Great Lakes. And there was another one. I'm just going to throw this in because we're talking about cryptids, but there's another one that I came across. I think this is a northern Michigan cryptid. It's called Meme Gouache. It's sometimes called the Michigan merman.
That's the
And
water panther. That's what I was
is
talking
it the
about.
same one? Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Because that was the
Wow.
name that I like knew it began with an M, but I wasn't gonna just try to pull the name out of my ass. Like I knew that it was I can like see the spelling of it in my head, but I wasn't gonna make an attempt at it. So I just layman terms it and called it the water panther.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll tell you this then. Since we mentioned Bigfoot in the pre-roll, there's an old account I saw recently. It's a group of people in the 1700s. They were up there in northern Michigan, I believe, and they actually testified under oath that they saw what they called a merman child on what's called Pie Island. And when you look closely at the details, it may have been less of a merman or mer being and more of like a wet monkey like Bigfoot like child, because when you get into the details of that account, they were talking about it having hair. It was hairy, and it maybe just looked amphibious at a distance because it was so wet. But I looked into it, and right next to that Pie Island is an island called Isle Royal, and it has a place called Wendigo National Park. So it's like cryptid, heaven up there. It's crazy.
Man, we even got like the Lake Michigan Triangle. So like
Mm,
in that, it's like the one corner of it goes to like Bray Road, and that's over, obviously in Wisconsin, or not Wisconsin. What state is that? That's Illinois. And then the other side of it touches Michigan, and then the other bottom of it goes to, I believe, Indiana or something. It basically like hits the corner where Lake Michigan's at, where like one side touches the bottom, the one side, and then over on Michigan. But the spot that it touches over in Michigan is one of the top like per capita UFO abduction areas. Like it's supposed to be like the third leading place, like at least back in the 70s, that like I think it was some ridiculous number, like 2 in 5 would say that they've had like an abduction experience in this area. And that's where like part of the Lake Michigan triangle phenomenon started. I feel was like with that center point, because usually people kind of create these triangles from big events, and then they start realizing that everything kind of falls within the center of that. And even falling within the center of that, man, on the other side that still kind of touches the lake is like Chicago and stuff like that, kind of
mhm.
touching into the part of the triangle. And everybody knows the whole thing with Chicago with all these like flying humanoids and everything, all the UFO sightings and everything that are near the O'Hare Airport. So that still kind of comes full circle into that with Bray Road and everything. And then going a little bit north, I know that this is becoming a little bit more popularized. There's not a lot of research really done on it yet because it's a hard spot to get to, but you have basically the like Lake Michigan, like Stonehenge is the best way to describe it. And it's
Yes.
like a little bit off into the water, but it's completely like in the water. So that's where somebody discovered it, I believe, within the last like 5, 10 years. And they haven't really been able to get down there enough to really do much research with it, but they know that there's this other metholithic structure that exists there. And it also, again, kind of falls into the phenomenon of the Lake Michigan Triangle, which, again, like you start diving into those things, and a lot of people kind of theorize that they could potentially be portals, ways to open different gates to different things. So is it like, is the reason why the Lake Michigan Triangle is active is because of that being there? Or is it possible that that's there because it's an active area and it would like enhance it possibly? Like something kind of weird to think about, but
Yeah.
there's so much weird stuff going on in Lake Michigan. And we haven't even talked about like Lake Superior. That's like a whole other monster all on its own. And that's where the water panther is. And I mean, on top of that, you have one of the deepest, coldest freshwater lakes, I believe, on the planet. And the whole thing with that is that there's so many ghost stories that go to it because when the water is that cold and it stays that cold year round because it's so deep, like nothing ends up floating back up. So everything that sinks just stays sunk. And like the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was one that, a lot of people know the Gordon Lightfoot song and all that. Like the reason why it wasn't found until years later was because it happened in Lake Superior, completely sank down. No bodies were found, no bodies or anything floated up from it. So knowing that about Lake Superior too, it kind of feels like it might play a tie in with the whole lake monster folklore that, you know, there's two sides of it. I definitely think there's a possibility that people were seeing things out there, but on the other side of it, there's got to be a good portion of it that was created off the fact that when nothing floats up, what are these people going to assume that more than likely something ate it? So, I mean, that could be a good portion of where some of these lake monster stories come from. It's just the fact that things don't float up and they were trying to rationally explain it in a time where they didn't have the same science that we do today to know that, it's too cold for anything to float back up. But
Yeah, these are, in my mind, these aren't just lakes. These are like freshwater oceans. And I really think, we have a lot of aquifers here on this continent. And I think that some of these underground oceans essentially is what these aquifers are. I think some of those connect to the lakes, and there's this whole underground network of waterways that we don't even know much about. So the extent of wildlife down there is I think is something, it's a frontier that we haven't tapped yet. And I think Michigan, if I'm correct, has like 3 to 4, possibly more lake monster you know lake monsters essentially, with names and everything that multiple people have seen. And what's interesting with the Michigan side of this is that there's some of these lake monsters were once known to be horned serpents, and they were called great horned serpents. And I just think that's wild that not only do you have a serpentine dragon like lake monster, but it also has horns. That seems like it goes back to an earlier era as well, with dragon lore and such.
I mean, even diving into like the whole antlered or horned serpent, I mean, that's something that you see across multiple cultures because the Cherokee have the Uktena, Uktena or Tena, and that's essentially like an antlered, like a horn. It's a horned serpent, but usually it's depicted with like antlers because like the Native American perspective on stuff. But I mean, that's something that you see throughout multiple cultures, especially Cherokees and these giant snakes being in the Americas and everything like that. But I'm trying to catch my train of thought. I had another really good point I was going to make. What was the last part of what you were saying here?
Well, I'll toss this in because I forget what the last part of my thing was, but I'll say this because this goes back to something you said. You were talking about the Michigan Stonehenge and how you're theorizing, is it there as like an enhancer for, the spirituality of the place essentially, or the metaphysics of the place. And I think that there's definitely something old and sacred about this area of Michigan. And I came across this healer from Estonia who moved here to the States in the late 1800s. And he was this famous actor in Dresden and Berlin, but something attracted him to Michigan and to an island specifically out on Lake Michigan. So he comes out and he relocates himself to this island in Michigan. And it's this ancient place where there was something tangibly sacred going on that drew him in. It's absolutely crazy. So I think with all these legends and lore, you have something, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, the phenomenon.
I mean, it's definitely a double-sided thing where, like, specifically Detroit, you see a lot of these, like, strange occult connections. Like, there's a music venue. Everybody associates it as a music venue now, but it's the Masonic Temple. And when you actually start looking into the history of it, like, that was one of the Masonic temples that, like, Crowley himself, or Aleister Crowley himself actually started back in, like, 1920 something. And he, like, started this temple, set it all up, and then like never ended up coming back to it. But there's like this weird underlying like occult history within specifically like the Detroit area. And like I'm sure you've probably heard about it, but like the Nain Rouge, which is like this little like red demon looking imp that supposedly has sightings near Detroit. You start diving into that and it's like it's almost like one of those weird things where you don't quite know where to go with it because you hear the depiction of it, and you associate it with like maybe something that's like more on the demonic side, which would explain why there's so much like occult stuff that happens in Detroit, is maybe there's a link to that. But on the other side of it, like Detroit, like the area was founded by I don't remember his first name, but his last name was Cadillac, which is why, you know, the car company Cadillac came to be. But there's like this whole thing where he supposedly had seen this thing too. Like there's generations and generations of people seeing this Nain Rouge, and it usually is seen right before like a tragic or like really, really bad event ends up happening. Like we had really, really bad racial riots back in the day, and supposedly like that thing was seen by like groups of people right before all this stuff started. Actually a different Cadillac, but the guy who owned the Cadillac car company, right before he had like a big downfall with his company, he claims that he had seen this thing, and he also claimed
Really?
that he saw it before he ended up going on to his like deathbed. So again, like they all describe it as like this little like imp looking thing, and it's like, is it something that's occult related? Or on the other side, I mean, because the occult and paganism seem to kind of have this like side tangent with each other, that it's just like a different viewpoint and faction of it. Because you know, most people associate paganism and occultism as like the full on same thing, but at least like when I talk to people, they're definitely in the same vein. I'm not going to deny that, but it seems like most pagans are a bit more natural, like earth based, where the occult stuff is obviously like the dark stuff that people start getting into, like, you know, methods of how to control people, methods about how to use like different types of dark magic and stuff. But the pagan stuff seems to be a little bit more like nature based. So
Hmm.
knowing like the pagan viewpoint of that, like, is it possible that this Nain Rouge might actually be some form of like a forest spirit or something like that, or like something that was a little bit more along the lines of like Pan or something like that? That's
Yeah.
something that was intended to protect the area, and people see
Hmm.
it before bad events, not because it's a harbinger of doom or something like the Mothman, but rather that it's like still angry that we're in this area, and maybe it's the reason those events start. So it's not that it's warning people of it, but it's starting these events every now and then just to try to get people out of this sacred area to whatever that being might be. But I mean, there's supposedly these festivals where people dress up and like go around doing it in Detroit, but anybody that's not familiar with Detroit, like it sounds good in practice. It sounds fun. It sounds like something you want to go do if you're into cryptids. But being from Detroit, like not my scene. Like Detroit isn't the safest place in the world where you just want to be like walking around having fun in like a costume and stuff like that. But
Yeah, it's not Mardi Gras.
yeah, it's not Mardi Gras. So I mean, like it sounds interesting, but like I don't know if I necessarily want to get involved in doing that. At least
Yeah, man,
in
that is
Detroit.
such an I've heard of that and I've read. Thank you for sharing that because there's a lot of stuff that a lot of details that you just filled me in on that I wasn't aware of with that red it's like an urban cryptid. That's the weirdest thing. But I like your
But it
theory there.
dates back to the beginning of
Yes.
Detroit, though, which is the weird part about it. So people associate it more with like an urban legend, but it has roots all the way back to like the formation of the city with like the original like fur trapper Cadillac.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of these, like for instance, Slender Man, I'm not going to go into it, but I think that it goes back to an earlier spirit, like a regional spirit, right? And I like Nalucephalea is what the Native Americans call it. Those are real tall, slender, dark, shadowy creature who had a lot of the same actions and mannerisms that we see with Slender Man. And it's like, well, did that whatever that is, that entity, did it somehow manage to find its way into our technology and come through and manifest that way? But going back to this pagan occult stuff within the cities, that's really fascinating stuff. And I came across a Lovecraftian cult that was based out of Chicago. And what they were doing was they were driving out into more remote areas. They were even going as far as Wisconsin, and they were going to lakes to do rituals. So that opened up this whole door for me into this world of lakes and essentially witchcraft because they were harnessing the power of the water. It's something to do with the water. I think like a lot of the like this conversation that we've had so far today, there's one of the key components is there's large bodies of water nearby. And
Something to think about with that too. First of all, like Crowley claimed that he was the one that like made the Loch Ness monster appear in Lake Loch Ness from doing rituals. So just
right.
like something to kind of think about on that side tangent with that. But
Hmm.
even in Michigan, it's like you have Pressy, which is basically like our variation of like this plesiosaur kind of described like being or creature. So, I mean, getting into the whole concept of like portals, vibration, frequency, like clearly there's something to it. And we're starting to prove that even in like mainstream science that everything that you see, everything you experience, it all breaks down to like vibration and frequency. So if you're trying to open up portals, you're trying to open up rifts, water itself, you can play a vibration on it, a frequency on it, and it'll ripple and it'll create these patterns. So I'm wondering if that plays a factor, that it's more so that you could potentially do it anywhere, but it's enhanced in places of water because of the fact that the medium, you can make it essentially like create shapes and patterns from projecting vibration and frequencies on it. So in turn, it might like amplify the abilities
Hmm.
of these portal locations, where
Hmm.
maybe rather than just hearing voices on the other side of it or hearing like, ominous disembodied beings on the other side of it, rather it creates like a medium that these things might potentially be able to pass through. And then when you start diving into that, man, like a lot of the UFO stuff, man, everybody's claiming these things are coming from the water and everybody's trying
Hmm.
to say that they're terrestrial and they're not extraterrestrial. Like, two sides of
Yeah.
that. I mean, it's definitely something I take into consideration that, at least from the appearance of these things, they could definitely be some type of underground dwelling being. But if you're looking at it from that perspective, like maybe they are coming from somewhere else and they're again just using the water as a medium.
Well, I think there might be a little bit of both going on, honestly. Like if you, not right now because there's snow on the ground here, but and other parts of the country, but if you go out in your backyard during the summer and you just take a moment, you just sit down in the grass and just look down, go anywhere in your backyard and just look down, and you're going to see that the ground is teeming with life. And if you were to take a shovel at a random spot in your yard and just dig up a piece of the earth, you're going to see more life that you didn't know was there. It's just, and like a lot of times when I'm in my backyard in the summertime, I usually see an insect or something that I had no idea existed. So, what if the supernatural realm is the same way? And what if we have these entities like that people are talking about during their DMT experiences, like these dimensional types? And then what if we have a faction of cryptids, I guess, I don't know what, a faction of aliens, what we would call aliens, some sort of other race living in the ocean as well?
I mean, I could definitely see the possibility of the fact that I've kind of wondered this myself, if the best way to interact with your environment will inevitably end up in some type of like humanoid type form, that you'll eventually get to a point where the best way to interact with your environment, especially if you're an intelligent being, is to be able to move freely around while also being able to grab and experience your surroundings with hands or some form of like appendage or something, so that you can interact properly with the environment. So at least maybe that would work a little bit differently on other planets where like the atmosphere is different, like they're maybe not even necessarily carbon based, but at least on this planet, the way that we've adapted to be this apex predator of the planet, if there are other things that could potentially get to that point, my assumption would be that they would eventually adapt to a point where they would essentially be this humanoid type form, because that would be the end all be all best form in order to navigate on this planet. So if you consider the fact of like different things possibly fitting into different niches, there's the humans of the land, which would essentially, like that's what we would be. Like, I don't see it as completely unplausible that there would also be a mutation that would adapt to be the humanoid version for the sea, and then the humanoid version for the forest or the mountains, because we are not existing in that niche, which could be where like the Sasquatch niche fits in. And at
Hmm.
least for that one, you talk to a lot of like natives and stuff like that, and they basically will describe it as not so much as like an animal, not so much as like some type of interdimensional type being, but rather that they're like the apex of what we were intended to be if we would have lived by like the rules of nature. So if you're viewing it from that point, that there may have been this diverging point where different things went in different directions and continued to adapt differently. I mean, that could one explain the mermaid phenomenon that people experience, because there would have been a section of it that would have eventually went to the water, just like how this little tiny rat looking creature ended up turning into a whale. It's because it went to the water and it was able to expand and it adapted to fit into that niche. And then you have again the ones that stayed in the forest, up in the mountains, and that's where you get the Sasquatch, Yeti, Yowie, any of the different names, Alamasi in Russia, if you want to call it that. And then on the other side of it too, this is where the other niche kind of comes in, the whole gray concept that, you had like the natives that would describe like the moon-eyed people, and they were described as these things that had these giant black eyes. They wouldn't necessarily, not necessarily black, but these giant eyes that they couldn't see in
They
light
were
for because they
black.
adapted. Yeah, they
They were
adapted.
nocturnal.
Yep, because that's where the name comes from moon-eyed people, is that they were only able to see like when it was dark out, when it was nighttime. So assumably, like that's an adaptation that you end up seeing with things that are under they dwell underground. Like you see that with like those fish species or those lizard species that end up existing in a cave for a really long time. Either one, they'll end up developing larger eyes where they can take in more light and they can sense things around them, or on the other end, they'll develop further into their other senses and completely lose the eyes in general. So it seems like there would also be a niche for something eventually going on underground. So it's like, is the gray concept that? Does that fall in with the moon-eyed people thing? Does that fall in with all these weird cave dwelling type creatures that people see and describe that all seem to have this like gray tone with like giant black eyes? Like,
Hmm.
I feel like there's these multiple niches where you're going to
Yeah.
need that end all be all apex predator. And if there's a sense of intelligence to them, they're going to avoid the other ones. And we just might be the ignorant ones because we think that we rule all the land, but that's because these other things that could easily, like, basically, like, turn on us and eventually get to a point where they could probably take us out. Like, we're completely oblivious to them and pretend like they don't exist. But, like, it's definitely possible, at
They're
least.
definitely there is an intelligence, and going into Keel and I know I've talked about him enough on here, but he would often refer to the phenomenon as an intelligence that kind of had different ways of manifesting itself. And then you also have a very more like ancient scripture folklore type of a perspective that I find very interesting from the book of Enoch, where there's a translation there where it seems like there was some sort of a cosmic struggle and between all these different entities, and some of them fell to earth, and wherever they landed they became a cryptid, an enhanced cryptid geared towards that specific region. So if they landed in water, they became mermaids. If they landed on in the forest, maybe they became a fairy or woodland spirit, or a protector of the woods like Bigfoot. So there's I think it's a I like that there's a mystery to this. I like that we're throwing out ideas and they're all very interesting ideas, but at the end of the day, the fact that this is a just a giant mystery that we can kind of chase after, there's something to be said about that. There's gold in the mysteries, and I think that these cryptid stories, and we've talked about a lot of cryptids so far, they speak to the mystery of this planet. And there are so many accounts of people seeing these, not everybody's lying. So it just blows me away sometimes how weird and magical this place really is. And I know that you have a story too. I'm excited to get into that, but and it was in Michigan. So what about where, because I don't know, where did you grow up in Michigan? Did you say it was Southern?
Yeah, well, southeastern Michigan, near
Okay.
like the Detroit area. I grew up like north of
Mm.
Detroit, but all like the suburban type areas, and then going out into like the country areas. But for anybody that's not familiar with the area, it's just easier just to say Detroit, the Detroit area.
Yeah, I got you. Did you have any do you know anybody who saw the Nain Rouge? Is that what it's called?
I have not. It's
Okay.
Neinrogue. So it's French for red, and then
Yeah.
the nine part. I don't know what that is offhand, but I
Hmm.
know like in German it means no, so like no red. But I don't think they're going to be mixing languages between German and French, so it's got to be something else with that. But
Oh yeah, man. I'm glad you brought that. I really am glad you brought that up today because that's such a wild cryptid. I've read about it. I've seen depictions of it too, where it's like this little red devil looking creature. But
it's like a nymph.
yeah, yeah. But I think I mentioned Wendigo earlier. I wanted to sprinkle that in because I think if I'm getting this correct, you do have some sort of a Wendigo story, right?
Yes, I have that experience, and then I also have some Sasquatch research that I was doing on the other side of the state, which is near like where the Dewey Lake monster sightings and stuff were. So I don't know which one you want to tackle first, because if you open up Bigfoot again, it might turn into a whole other can of worms. But uh,
Mm.
I also have another can of worms I can open as far as like my explanation as to where I've kind of come as far as researching after like my main experience that kind of pushed me into where I am now with podcasting and researching and doing all this stuff I do. Because you have like these weird events, and then you just have that one that's like the turning point. And then after that, it's like you
Mhm.
put so much time and effort into researching that, and then it just branches into the other things. And then next thing you know, you're running a podcast. So
Yeah, yeah. Which one was it for you that was the milestone turning point? Which experience?
that would have been the I don't even still like calling it a Wendigo. Like I definitely come to that conclusion, at least from my research, but I'm definitely open to other people's interpretation and explanation of what it could possibly be. Because when it comes to this phenomenon, I mean, it's all of us creating theories, and it ends up becoming whatever makes the most sense to you. And that's kind of what I came to was the Wendigo, but not how people imagine the Wendigo, which is this whole backstory explanation I can get into a bit. But that would have definitely been like the turning point, because even within that, I saw that within the phenomenon and explanations of phenomenon, there's a lot of divergence and like mixing of folklore with the whole concept of like how history is written, where like it's written by the victor. Whoever ends up conquering the area has this weird way of manipulating whatever the original folklore was. And that definitely seems to be what happened with the whole Wendigo concept, especially after like putting a ridiculous amount of research into it.
Well, that's cool, man. It seems like let's touch on that a little bit, and you can tell that story too if you want, because it sounds like you've kind of grown with this story.
It's one of those weird stories where it's like the farther it gets, I don't even like calling it a story, because story kind of seems like it
Sure.
has the connotation of like I definitely saw something. It was definitely something
Yeah.
that wasn't normal, and I've tried to explain its sense, but it's like the more that time goes on, the more you like question yourself about it even more, and it's like, is that really what I saw, or is you get to a point where it's like you just get established with this is what I experienced at least. So then you end up unintentionally creating this like bias over the experience, and it just sucks that the farther away from it you get, it's the less of a grasp you really feel like you had on even understanding it in the first place.
Yeah, and I'll say this too about the Wendigo. I think that maybe it's been misinterpreted. Maybe these images that come to mind of this big, daunting antlered thing, maybe that's not what this is, because I think it comes from Algonquin folklore, from Native American folklore. And from the cases I've studied, it seems like, which there are hundreds of documented cases of this, where people killed other people because they said they were taken over by this. So it was almost like a spirit.
See, I guess this kind of opens up the can of worms for me to at least get into where I think the differentiation came in. And I don't know if anybody else has necessarily thrown this theory, but this is at least the conclusion that I ended up coming to. So, what most people would describe as the Wendigo is this half monster, deer-headed, skulled, antlered type being, but the natives did not describe it that way.
Hmm.
And Wendigo is one of those things. It's kind of like Sasquatch, that depending on the tribe, there's the same being that's described, but it has different names. Like there's the Wachuge as another example for it. Like it's something that's seen mixed throughout it. Like it's not just specific to like one Native American culture. Mainly stuff more towards the north, but I'll kind of get into like more of the explanation with that as we keep going. But so the image of the Wendigo is not how the Native Americans would have described it. They described it as this tall, lanky, almost zombie-like creature that would be so have such a thirst and hunger that it would eventually end up like eating its lips off. And so basically it's described as this like tall, lanky, zombie-like creature. So the whole idea of the Wendigo as people describe it now, I think was one of those things where it was the same as like what the settlers did as they came across renaming these Native American like sacred grounds, where they would say like this is whatever this location is, and they go, okay, well it's pagan, it looks like a teapot, boom, it's the devil's teapot. That's what we're gonna call it now. So they end up putting this idea of what they believe the demonic is on top of the already existing Native American folklore. So they're describing this zombie-like creature to these settlers coming across. And as these settlers start retelling these stories, they start adding their depictions of what they believe is evil looking on it. So diving into, again, the people that were coming over here were like the Christians and, all the different people that were more so in that faith base and not pagan religion based. So they would demonize these things and again call things like the devil's tea kettle and just give it this dark connotation to it that kind of is influenced by paganism. So as they're talking about this essentially demon-like creature, they started adding their flair onto it, which got into, it has a skull head, now it has this antler head, now it has this, and it started kind of taking on like the pagan viewpoint behind it. And the story ended up getting mixed to a point where we got to a point where it's like, does this thing even exist? People haven't seen sightings of it. There are some people that claim to see these things that are seen like this, but I honestly think that's something else that's just taking the image of something that you already know, because there's this whole other faction of the phenomenon. Because when I had my experience, I started researching into what this thing was, because what I saw was tall and lanky. And again, I'll get back into that story in a little bit, but it was, I'd always fall back into either one, the rake or the pale crawler. And it seemed like that was a more new age thing, that when the Wendigo thing started dropping off, all of a sudden people started reporting these things and the Wendigo stopped getting reported like that. So I think it was one of those things that once the folklore got mixed enough, people separated it and then they started seeing this being that was just already had a name, was already described, and they had to give it a new name because it didn't fit into the viewpoint that eventually turned into. So people started calling it stuff like the rake or the pale crawler. And I even think there's two sides, even within that phenomenon, that there's the Wendigo side to it. And then there's this other thing that I was talking about a little bit earlier in the show about this niche of these things living underground. And there's two sides of the phenomenon where people will see these things near like cave entrances, and they'll also see them near like snowy wooded areas, which kind of goes more into like the whole like Wendigo idea of things. But I think that what people are calling pale crawlers and rakes are actually Wendigos, but they didn't know the name, so they created this new name on top of it. And then as that name continued on, it started also getting mixed in with cave dweller sightings. So then pale crawler, Wendigo, rake, like it's all consisting of essentially the same thing. And it's just miscommunication within the culture. It's like playing telephones, which you see when you start really diving into these like ancient, these like folklore creatures, is that there's like this blending of, you know, people that are seeing these black dogs in like West Virginia. There were people that were coming from like England. There were people that were coming from Germany, and they already had these like huntsman dog stories and these other black dog stories. Then all of a sudden these things are following them there. And it's like, are these things actually following them there? Definitely a possibility. I'm not going to deny the paranormal and stuff, but you know, you have this combination where like folklore starts getting blended between cultures, and then it gets so screwed from like what it originally was that now there's this thing that was what people were seeing, and they start calling it something different because the folklore gets too out there and blended because too many people are playing telephone with it. And yeah, I definitely think that that's what ended up happening with the Wendigo. And like, just to get into some more explanation of these things and why I said they're seen across cultures, but generally stuff more towards the north. The whole thing with the Wendigo was that it was rotting flesh. Like you would end up becoming a Wendigo because you resorted to cannibalism during the winter. Or, for example, with the Wichuge, the thing with the Wichuge was that it was when you had too much pride. If you started thinking that you were better than everybody else, then you would eventually turn into this monster. And with the Native American stories, it's like, do you take it literally, or is it supposed to be metaphorical for something that, one, you got to survive the winter, and then maybe it was another description of what they were trying to describe as far as like, you know, when people start eating human flesh, like you start going crazy. Like you're not supposed to eat your own species, because you even see that with other species when you feed them the same species. But like trying to describe something symbolically through a story. But on the other side, again, it's like I had a weird sighting. Like, are we also reblending that stuff in with them trying to tell stories, or was it a double faceted thing that they were like, we're seeing this weird creature, but we're also going to add this layer of a story to it to also warn people against something that they need to be aware of?
Well, yeah, can I jump in here for a second? Because I'm hearing you out, and I think that there is something psychological to this, because it seems like, yeah, it could be the human mind going crazy, but also it could be a cautionary tale of these long, harsh winters. And I think it really does come down to those winters, though. Like there are these long, dark, cold winters. You know, this phenomenon comes out of Canada, from what I could tell, and it's just way colder up there and the winters are way more extreme. And these people didn't have houses like we have today. They didn't have heat. They were out in the woods, many of them. And you're cooped up and you're surrounded by winter. Everything's dead around you. So, and if you run out of food, that's going to create a problem for you and everybody around you, especially if you have a family. And like in the case of like Swift Runner, it's attributed to a Wendigo, but he was this Native American Cree trapper guy in Alberta, Canada, who in the 1800s killed and started eating his family while he was supposedly possessed by this demonic Wendigo spirit. Was that a
Just to
Wendigo
throw into that
or?
part of it too, they supposedly said that there was also an establishment that he would have been able to get supplies like within
Yeah.
a distance that he could get to. So it's
Yes.
a matter of, was the guy
It's
possessed by something,
right.
or like was it literally that he resorted to it because he felt like he couldn't get to it? But there's a lot of weird stuff to that there was literally like an outpost station like within viable distance from where he was, even though these acts still ended up happening. Just sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, just to throw
No,
that part in.
that's perfect. I'm glad you added that in because that adds a lot of perspective to this. And I think that when you look at this guy, he was also a master hunter. These people knew how to live off the land. He's got the outpost nearby, like you're saying, and he can also go out and catch some game if he needs to. Why did he resort to eating his entire family? Essentially, I think maybe one kid survived. You look into it, there's something dark to this. There's something more than just going crazy out in the woods because it's wintertime. There does seem to be influence from some other darker, more ancient type of an intelligence.
I mean, you want to get real weird with it, man. We ended up doing an episode on all this stuff on Bizarre Encounters at one point, and we even threw out the theory of this. And this is going to sound ridiculous, but I'll kind of get full circle with this,
Sure.
that these Wendigo beings were actually starving giants during the winter. And this is kind of how we came to this conclusion. So everybody who's dived into like the ancient America stuff, it's like the more research you do on it, it's almost like these giant skeletons are, you can't overlook them anymore. Like they're
Yeah.
there. It's one of those things that I don't even question. Like there's
Hmm.
so much to it and there's so much backing to it that it's clearly this cover up of history for whatever reason. I mean, I don't know if it's some grand conspiracy or rather just not wanting to change the history books because these bigger beings were existing here, but like the natives described them, like everybody described these things. So we kind of came to the conclusion of, you have a bigger body, you're a bigger species, you're obviously going to need to ingest more to sustain yourself. So they usually describe these Wendigo beings as being bigger. Like they usually don't describe them typically as like human size, which is where like the tall lankiness kind of comes in. So, if you're viewing it from that perspective, that these things could have been the giants that were starving and they basically would go crazy and would just eat anything that they could possibly find as food, definitely a possibility. And bringing in an extra step farther, which gets a little bit less into the more like tangible, provable stuff currently, you get into all the like Nephilim theories that people have kind of thrown in, that these things were like, essentially they ended up turning into disembodied beings, which would have inevitably turned into like kind of like what we describe as like demons now. So like the Wendigo spirit, something being possessed by the Wendigo spirit, could it have been that these were giants that were starving during the winter, and when they died off, that evil presence that would take people over would be the fact that they were disembodied like Nephilim spirits or consciousness or whatever you want to call them. So it's like two sides of the phenomenon, that there was something physical happening, but on the other side, there could have definitely been something more on the spiritual side or the currently unexplained side that
I
could have
like
played something
that.
into it.
I like that because the more I've looked into this, and like I say, I think Canada has a lot of great folklore. I just want to add that in because I think it gets overlooked by a lot of us American podcasters. So I don't know. I'm not speaking for your show. I'm just talking about other shows. I don't see a lot of emphasis being put on the stuff that happens in Canada, but the stuff up there is just wild. But I'm looking at this case. Jack Fiddler is what I was thinking about. He's this Native American Wendigo hunter. And just the fact that there's a Wendigo hunter who it kind of lends some credence to this. He's up in the boreal forests and which is this very ancient sacred strip of forestry that encircles the top of the globe. It spans the top of the earth, but he claimed to have defeated 14 Wendigos in his lifetime. Because, and some of them he said were sent by enemy shaman. So, and some were like members of his own village who were said to be taken over, like visibly taken over, and like at the drop of a hat, they went crazy and they started trying to eat like human flesh, and Fiddler was caught up in the mix of this war, it seemed like, with these ancient spirits. And I don't know, that just to me says that maybe there's more to this than just like mental illness gone awry, right?
See, and this might tie into like a good spot to tell my experience because there's definitely a physical component and then there's this other spiritual component. And I'm very logically thinking. Like I dive into all of these weird topics, but I'll make some outrageous claims, but I'll like do this step by step of the information that I've had that gets me to that point because I have to get to these ridiculous points sounding to people after first having a step by step that scientifically like makes sense to me. So like diving into like my experience. So we used to do urban exploring at this place called Northville Psychiatric Hospital, which is in Northville, Michigan. And we would go there like every weekend. I'm trying to like, I had some other weird stuff that kind of happened in the process of it, but I'm trying to condense it down a little bit. But we used to go there almost every weekend. We got to the point where we had this like whole place like mapped out. It was like a campus. It wasn't just one building. So there was like the main hospital. There was like dormitories for boys, girls, like this school and everything that was on there. And we would definitely, we got pictures of orbs and everything like that. Like, I mean, definitely could be dust. But still kind of interesting all the same that there may have been this like spiritual component to it. Cause a lot of people talked about this place as it was haunted, but we never really had any like crazy experiences like haunting wise. So I didn't really put much back into that component of it, but rather that it was just kind of like an old building. But the only kind of paranormal experience we really had was we were on a floor that had none of the windows broken out and this random blue door with a giant smiley face on it slammed shut. And you can hear people running around in a building that's abandoned, like everything's silent. So if anybody was messing with us, we would have heard it because second the door slammed, we all froze and we were listening for anything that made noise. And right after I opened the door and I left it just to see if it would slam shut again somehow from like a breeze or something like that. It never did. So that was the only like weird paranormal thing like that. But um kind of building into this like main experience I ended up having at this place. This may tie in with it. I always tell it as part of this because I don't know if it does, but I guess if I mention this part to the right person, maybe it will end up connecting some dots. But being from Michigan, like at least southern Michigan, like we don't have cougars. Like you don't see big cats or anything like that around here. So behind this place, there was like this little tiny area of like forest and trees. Not anything big, maybe like a quarter mile, nothing ridiculous or nothing. But we're up on the third story of the building and we're looking down into like the courtyard where like the back goes into like the forest and everything. And we end up seeing this cougar that walks out of the forest line and basically looks directly up at us, which seemed kind of weird for a cougar to like look up at us on the third floor. And then it just slank back into the forest and or into like the wooded area. So I was like, I just saw a cougar. Did anybody else see that? And my girlfriend's friend that was with us was like, no, I definitely saw that too. That was a big cat. And that was the way that we had to like leave to go out. So we ended up doing this like 2 mile walk all the way around this area because we didn't want to take the chance of like going through those woods and, coming face to face with this thing. But I ended up like looking up sightings and stuff. And there was cougar sightings in Northville just in that area, but nobody had ever found a body. Nobody had ever found anything with it. So it's just this weird thing that kind of fell into like obscurity. But this is where it might kind of tie in with everything. So we'd gotten to a point where we'd been to this place so many times that we had everything mapped out. It was like almost to a point where it was like, all right, we're kind of getting bored of this place. We might have to find some new place to go. But underneath is this thing called the Northville Tunnels. And actually, Linda Godfrey wrote about it in her like weird Michigan book, these like different murders at some point that had happened in these tunnels and everything. But they're like this tunnel system that completely connects under Northville. Like it goes way past the hospital and everything else. And we hadn't really gone down there because it's completely pitch black and we didn't want to take a chance of like running out of batteries in our flashlights, anything like that, and basically having to scale the wall back for 5 miles if we just kept walking down in this area. So one day we just decided, you know what, we're just going to go in and just kind of look around, just check it out. We're not going to go too far in. We're just going to see what's going on down there. So at the main hospital, you go into like the basement and it leads into the tunnels because it was supposed to be a way to like easily be able to like transfer patients during like if there was some type of weather event happening, something like that. So it was just access tunnels at that point where they could bring patients through them potentially if they needed to. So we knew that there was an entrance that would go into the tunnels from down there. So it's me, my girlfriend, and one of her friends. And we end up going down the stairs to go into the basement. And as we go down into the basement, there's this brick wall to the right side. And it wasn't a doorway like per se, but it looked like somebody had like removed the bricks, not like somebody kicked them out like a vandal, somebody vandalizing the place, but at some point like somebody had professionally like removed these bricks to create like a little arch doorway right there, right? So I'm like, oh, that looks interesting because normally we came in from the other side, so we hadn't come down this staircase before into this basement to peek around or anything. So I go down into that area because I'm coming down the stairs and this is to my right. So I turn and I go into that room where that doorway is. I take maybe a foot and a half or so into that doorway. I have my flashlight facing forward and I hear this disembodied voice in my right ear go, run. And as I hear run, I look forward and there's this metal, like the hospital carts, like the little girdy, like metal hospital carts that's sitting there. And this thing goes to stand up. And it was this tall, lanky, decrepit, not human looking because its forearms, its arms, like its body wasn't shaped in proportion to like how a normal human body is shaped. And it had this bluish gray, like almost decaying looking colored skin. And it had this greasy black lanky hair on the top of its head. And I saw this thing go to stand up and I just see the back of this thing. And as it's standing up, I see it starting to crouch up and I start realizing that this thing doesn't have the normal shape of a person. Because at first, you're going to be like, oh, it's a crackhead, it's somebody that's homeless or something down in the basement. But as soon as this thing stood up and I saw the way that it was shaped, it wasn't even like that insane moment of fear where you start seeing something that's not there. Like this thing was not shaped like a normal person. And I've never seen somebody with decaying looking skin color or this like falling out patchy black greasy hair. So I see that back. I don't even see this thing's face. I take off up the stairs with with my girlfriend and her friend behind me, and they're like, whoa, what's happening? What's happening? And I just was basically like, run, let's get out, follow me. Like, no questions asked. Like, I went into like that mode where like my main focus was I don't want to freak them out. I'm trying to get them out of here without telling them. Because as soon as I tell them what I saw, they're either one, going to freeze up and try to look back and see if it's still there, or two, they're just going to freak out. So it was like the best scenario was to get everybody out of the building before I tell anybody what I had seen. So I knew the direct path to get out of this place. So I got them behind me. We're taking off. So with that, knowing that they had no contacts, my girlfriend, she's a photographer. She ends up taking pictures behind us as we're running out. She's not stopping to take them. She's just taking them behind us. So we end up getting back and I explained to her like what I had seen and everything. And we end up looking back through the pictures and I can send them to you actually after we finish the show. But we basically got a picture of the exact thing that I saw. But the weird part about it was it looked like an apparition that in the picture it's transparent, like you can see through it. And I have the completely original image, and then I have an image that we lightened up just so you can see it better. But you can see the long black hair, you can see the white skin on its face. Like it was this weird thing where it was definitely something physical that I saw, but there was these like non-physical attributes, like the voice in the side of my ear, because there was nobody there. Because I looked to that side before I looked back at what was going on in front of me, because I caught movement with my eye. But it just, didn't know like where to like go with that information like forever because it was so just like out there. I didn't know what to even do with that information. Like even when I first started my show, like I didn't really tell anybody about this experience because it was just so out there that it was like I didn't want to become a podcaster and start making these like, oh, I have this crazy story.
Yeah.
Like the reason I got into it is because I had this experience. But it wasn't until I started doing later shows that I started kind of bringing in more components to it. And like I said, with my research, I kept coming back to like Wendigo, even though it wasn't how it was visually described. And then I kind of came to my own conclusions and started kind of following this trail with the whole like bringing the paganism fact into everything. But as I started doing shows and I started kind of hinting at it, I had some other people bring up some other aspects that I had overlooked that I hadn't really thought about. And part of the Wendigo legend is that you're not safe from the first snowfall to the last. So they're out when it is cold because assumably these things are like these decaying body flesh. Like they have to keep themselves like preserved. Like They're not seen during the summer because they'd be rotting in the hot summer sun. So the other aspect of the folklore that people have theorized is that these things go underground during warmer months, or they bury themselves underground during warmer months, or they go into caves or something like that during warmer months. And this would have happened in, I believe, spring. And the weird part was connecting back in with that folklore, which is why, again, I'm not saying this is definitely what it was, but it's what my research has definitely pointed to. The tunnels were like 20, 30 degrees colder than the surface. And going into those tunnels, it just gets colder as you go in. So somebody pointed out, like, it fits the lore of these things that during the warmer months, they would be staying somewhere that is colder. So it, like, they wouldn't have left that area though, because it's like 30 degrees colder. So it would make sense to see it down there. And even the whole like spiritual aspect of these things, where there's like this internal struggle that there's, according to the folklore, this aspect that's still human inside these things, while there's also like the monster that's inside these things. And sometimes you can get to this moment where if you know the being's name when it was human, it'll freeze up and it'll have like humanity for a second before whatever the dark being is inside of it will like take back over. So Justin actually from Cryptids of the Corn a long time ago and mentioned the fact that, like, I have Cherokee, like my grandma's 100% Cherokee. I'm 25%. So he kind of theorized of, was that disembodied voice that you heard actually the human inside of this thing that was trying to warn you to get away from it before it couldn't control itself anymore? And it basically warned you and talked to you, not necessarily because you were the first to walk in the room, but because you shared the same ethnic blood as this thing, that it didn't want to hurt you. Because on the other side of it, in Northville, there was two random deaths where somebody had like fallen down the elevator shafts at one point. And the weird part about it was, as many times as I had been there, like the elevator doors, there's no power to this place, but they weren't wide open. They were like thin cracks. Like if anybody wanted to get in those, they would have had to force themselves in it. And like, I don't know why you would have done that at that point. So then, these things were the people, of course, you'd fall down, you'd be seen at the bottom of this thing, and the bottom enters out into the basement. So then I started questioning, like, are these random deaths maybe linked to whatever this thing was that I saw? And
I
then as
think
I'm starting to
so.
connect all these dots, this is the last weird part of the story. They end up tearing down this building. So when it comes to
Oh,
weird stuff like this, I wonder if like cities are aware, they hear
yeah.
the stories, and either one, they're just trying to stop the stories, or two, they know something's there. And it's that whole concept of like, the town at night will get together to burn down the house of the monster. And then the next morning they're all like, oh, what happened to that house? Nobody knows anything about it now. So it's like
Yeah.
they're aware of it, but they're just gonna pretend like, oh yeah, we just, we want to turn it into a park. Like, well,
Right.
there's nothing going on there. What are you talking about?
On the aspect of paganism or spirituality, I do want to throw in that the cougar aspect of this story. Cougars are associated traditionally with shaman and shapeshifters.
And that's the other part that I was saying, that it's like I feel like it ties in because that's not an animal that's in this region, especially not near the Detroit area specifically. Like, it's
Right.
just weird, Like,
Yeah. And I also see your struggle with, do I call it a Wendigo or do I not call it a Wendigo? And I also see why you've just went ahead and said, okay, well, for the sake of a title, we'll just call it a Wendigo. That makes sense too, because this could very well be that. And
I like putting the asterisks just because I am
yeah.
open to other ideas. But like I've said a bunch of times, like that's where my research led. I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm saying that
Hmm.
that's the end that I keep ending up at.
Yeah. And like for me, with my the study I've done with this and with this cryptid, I think that, and this is just my opinion, I think it's a spirit that waited for people to be at their weakest. So that, of course, happens during winter, and when people were in the middle of that dense winter, when they were very hungry and sort of, I don't know, depleted from lack of sunlight, and if they're venturing out for food, this thing will pounce. It'll jump into them, often disguising itself as hunger. So
see,
you think you're just going crazy out of hunger, but that's this emotional trick that this thing is playing on you.
see, that seems like it almost could potentially tie back into the little bit more biblical theory on this thing, that you know,
And I'm
these
getting that
things
from
may
these
have
old
been
stories. So
like the giants, and then it's because what does that sound like? It sounds like a demon. It sounds like
yeah.
the disembodied beings, and it's not necessarily that they're taking it over, but it's like the same thing with schizophrenia almost, that it's like there's a lot of people that research it and say they come back to like there's a dark being that's attached to this, and this is the explanation of what this is. So if you have this dark being that's just whispering these things in your ear, especially like you were saying during these harsh months, it's a lot easier to influence these people at that point. So it's like if you have this like, for lack of a better term, as much as I hate using this term for things, but like demon whispering in your ear all winter, like, oh yeah, you know, your kid is being real irritating. Like he just won't give you 5 minutes alone. It would sure be good if he just wasn't around anymore, but you're really hungry. So, I mean, two birds, one stone. Like if you spend your whole winter just stuck in this cabin or this small loft with your family and you just kept hearing that, it's almost like the Shining concept, you know, like there's eventually a point where even, you know, the most wintered huntsman, you know, like winter, the people are like, there's a snapping point eventually of when you keep having this like whispering confrontation in your ear. Like, I
Mhm.
think that there's like multiple components to it that like, even within the native view of it, I feel like it's something older than that, where even the viewpoint that we're trying to look at as the origin could still potentially be the first generation of telephone, and we're in the second generation of telephone, and it's actually, even from like the origins that we're looking at, it's still a mix of multiple things that created this thing that we think is the origin, but it actually goes back farther than that.
Yeah. I think there's a commonality between your story as well, and these old stories from folklore, and I think what I gather from that, from just the 1,000 foot view, is that this is a spirit of mayhem and destruction, and maybe that ties into with things just get out of control with this spirit, like the town that comes in and destroys the building because there's two deaths. Maybe things just got so weird. Like you're seeing cougars, doors are slamming, people are dying, with in an elevator shaft that's like, you could kind of tell what it is. You shouldn't just be falling into that. And so these people come in and tear down this building because it got out of control. Like this Jack Fiddler story. It's like it got so out of control that this Wendigo hunter rose up in opposition to this thing, like Batman versus Joker. Like, Joker exists because of Batman, right? It's just an opposition thing, or vice versa. So and then you get back to the spiritual aspect of this, where you have this shaman who has to come in and deal with the spirits. I don't know. That's just where my mind goes with this. I think that the line between mythological spirits and, well, I'm not going to say that because I don't know. That's the best part about this is it's a mystery. But you see where my head's going with
I
this.
mean, I'll even throw this in too. It's like you always have these weird creature sightings or these weird paranormal sightings or demonic attachment experiences that seem to happen near these old abandoned locations. And one thing that I've often wondered is like you go into these places and what does everybody end up doing? They create all these like sigils on the walls, you know, whether they're not, they're actually like people who are into the occult or people that are just like, ha ha ha, I'm going to put a symbol on this wall because it's going to scare people. Like, I don't think people realize how much potential power could be like within symbols that like, you know, there may have been nothing going on at this place, but now you have projected thought on this place. So you have like the what's the name? What's that word? The goal, not golem. I always mix this one up with the tulpa
Yeah.
concept. On top of now you have these power symbols that are everywhere, even though they may have not have been intentionally created as power symbols, but they're existing within this area. So it's like, or people that are vandalizing and not knowing what symbols they're trying putting on the wall just because they're trying to be funny or they don't believe in the occult and they're just putting these pagan symbols all over the wall. They don't realize what they're doing and they're actually creating like gateways or opportunities for tulpas to form with enough energy and thought, because it's like there's all this energy and thought in this place being haunted. So there's already this like fixated, thick, murky cloud of energy. And then once you put a symbol on the wall, it's now focused into a point or a place. So it's like the whole Slenderman thing, you know, like it seems like it's something that kind of connected into something farther on, but like the whole Tulpa concept coming into the idea of that so many people projected energy on it that it's almost like it created created something there, or on the other side, there was something already existed there, and because that energy was already formed on there, it basically took the image of that in order to be able to still function and be able to harness this energy or luge or whatever it might be that these things want from us. But it seems like no matter what way you look at it, these things want us in this dark state and they want to be in these heavy dark states. And anytime you have an area where it has this air that's almost thick to the point where you can like taste it or cut it, like I feel like it's inevitable that something is eventually going to realize that that is like a giant buffet and just take on full advantage of it, even if it wasn't there in the first place. But it'll take the image of whatever the urban legend is that people put in that area, because then it's like anytime you think about it, it's almost like you're like, I don't want to say praying to this entity, but in a way, like praying to this entity or giving like respect to this
Yeah.
entity. So it's just collecting this. And
Yeah, and with
just
this with the symbols, it's like with the sigils, that's like a spiritual technology that it's using to manifest itself. Just like I think like maybe you mentioned Slender Man, like maybe what was happening there, it's using the internet not as a spiritual technology, but as this electromagnetic technology that kind of runs between dimensions, perhaps, and it's using that to bridge the divide between our world and their world. Because I think there are things coming into our reality. I think the government knows about it. I think the FBI, when you hear John D'Souza talk about it, he says that he was dealing with cases in the FBI where somebody was there 1 second on a trail and gone the next. Everybody who was with them all but saw them disappear. And it's like something came out of a portal, grabbed this person, and went back in. And they tie it in with this missing 411 thing. So I think they can come into our reality, and they're finding new ways, including the internet, to bridge the divide between worlds. And I think the internet might be the new sigil magic. This computer might be the new scrying mirror, you know? So
I mean, I definitely have thought about this a lot. The whole aspect of like, did we create the internet, or was it rather that we just found a way to tap into something that already existed? And in turn, by tapping into it, these things that are on this other side are making us think that we're creating something, but really what we're doing is we're actually altering. I don't even necessarily want to say altering, but like we're actually connecting our reality into their reality, and they're letting us create this like bridge work, like almost like we're creating this virtual reality that you can almost view as the bridge, but right on the other side of the wall, if we keep going further, is the complete opening of this other reality. And these things are still walking through the cracks in the wall that's happening there, but like once we push to a certain point, we've essentially created this bridge between their reality and our reality. And I mean, I kind of get into this theory with like the whole DMT realm. Like, is that the internet realm, but we're connecting into it from a different perspective? Because people talk about these things being like almost like futuristic or like interdimensional looking. And it's like, I think that there's a good possibility that the internet realm, the DMT realm, the demonic realm, so to speak, are all the same thing, just different names. And we don't necessarily realize like what we're full on tapping into. And this whole demons in the system concept is definitely something that people got to put a little bit more validity behind, because you get like these chat bots into these weird spots where you start asking these questions. They'll start giving these like really weird, off-colored, dark answers. Then all of a sudden it'll seem like, like a new representative sat down, and then all of a sudden it's back to the like robotic responses. Is it like, again, we're tapping into this intelligence and it's just a matter of it's sitting back and like not letting us realize like how far we are to actually like breaking down that final dividing wall, where now this reality, this virtual reality, so to speak, becomes the bridge to whatever is on that other side.
if there's a spiritual realm, and I believe there is, I think that they're going to use the internet as a template, as a way to interface with us. And I think it goes back to an older form of metaphysical technology. I think it goes back to portals and dimensions, not to be the guy that always points to portals, but I think there's something to that. And I think going back to this Wendigo stuff, there's a native legend that if you hear the sound of a kettle being struck in the woods, it's the Wendigo, and you need to get home as soon as possible. And then in modern times, people in these missing 411 cases report hearing a metallic kettle like bang in the woods, like something that sound is like associated with something perhaps coming into our dimensions. So I think the old stories reflect the modern accounts in a lot of ways. We names change, you know, Slender Man. it's so much like this Nilusa thing that the Native Americans talked about in the 1800s. We've just changed the name, and the times have changed, the surroundings have changed. Um,
Look at all the
so
ancient gods. They're all archetypes of the same things. They all have the sun god, they have the god of love, they have this. It's like, and then it also again fits into like the fallen angel paradigm where it's like, I'm not saying one perspective is correct, but I think that like all these different religions have different perspectives of the same events, and we're just again calling these things different names as they go through different periods in time. And I mean, you even see that with like other things like UFOs, all this stuff. It's like the phenomenon changes and like adapts depending on the time. And again, it's the same thing, it's the same archetype. It's just a matter of these things clearly have the ability to like alter reality or your perception, or they will alter what you're viewing in order to make it so that maybe it's a little bit more like you know what you're looking at. You know what I mean? Like they're not going to come
well,
at you as some like
on that note, with your story, what did you think? Because I always ask people this, like deep down, when you saw that thing in that abandoned building, what did you think? Instinctually, what did you think it was? Did you feel like you were dealing with something ancient or what?
I felt like I don't even know how to describe it. Like I definitely kicked into the matter of like I just need to get out of here, and I don't know if
Yeah.
necessarily know if I put thought into that at that time, but
Well, what if you go back to that? If you travel back to the moment when that happened, is there a lingering feeling there that you could tap into that? Because I think when we encounter these things
it felt
subconsciously,
paranormal, but
yeah,
like but it also seemed physical. Like it's that's where I said it's like a hard feeling to describe because it's like it felt very paranormal, but the thing that I saw was visually very physical.
I
So just
understand.
this weird blending that's like hard. It's hard to describe. You know, it's like a
Yeah.
lot of like some of like the Sasquatch stuff that people experience. Maybe it's just a lack of understanding. So you start bridging the gap in your mind with these other theories on it. But
No, fair enough. And I'm glad you said Bigfoot because I've had Bigfoot experiences. And like you, I'll just say that I don't know for sure that that's what they were, but that's what I'm calling them. And I didn't know what I was looking at. So I didn't have a huge sense of fear for some of those. Some of them were extremely scary. Basically, I just lived in this community in North Carolina in the mountains, and there was a lot of weird stuff happening. And my girlfriend saw one out in the open. It crossed out in front. She had a really long driveway and it crossed right out in front of her car. So she was scared to death and she was a total believer in Bigfoot. And I didn't have any thoughts on it at that time. I didn't know what she saw, but I knew she saw something because it scared her to death. So, and then I would go on to have other encounters with whatever's happening in this area. And sometimes I just didn't have a thought to be scared. Other times I did. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it does make sense because it's like again, I feel like part of the fear either comes from one, an aspect of it being unknown, or two, an aspect of you thinking you know what it is. So in turn, then you know to be afraid of it. It's kind of
mhm.
like the chicken or the egg concept. It's like which one comes first? Like they both seem like they could definitely be plausible.
Yeah. And at the time, I didn't believe in Bigfoot at all. So I thought that I believed in the paranormal because before we moved to this place in the mountains, I did live in a house that was all intents and purposes haunted, very haunted. So I did believe in the paranormal and I believed that things could take spirit form. So a lot of times I was attributing this to the paranormal because I didn't believe in Bigfoot yet. So anyway, and I know, thank you for telling your story, by the way. And I know you mentioned Bigfoot. Did you want to get into any of that today?
If you want, man, I always like having excuses to be able to like interact and do another podcast with someone because anybody that's a podcaster, you do these things, you have these great conversations, and then you like run out of stuff to talk about, and then you like lose touch for a while. So I feel like it might be a good spot that we can leave it, and then we already have something to gateway into next time because I
Okay.
could go for another hour on Bigfoot, man. So it's like
Yeah.
we can do like a whole show just
Let's
tackling
just,
Bigfoot stuff because I haven't seen anything firsthand, but I've definitely had Bigfoot experiences.
mhm.
So I could
Okay, we'll
definitely
leave
dive
it.
into that stuff.
Yeah, we'll leave it as a cliffhanger because it sounded like you had a nice body of work on this subject. Like the way you were talking about it earlier, you were alluding to it like you've got a lot of stuff to say about Bigfoot. And I know you do because of your show, but it seems like you've got some like newfound information or something you're working with. So let's just leave it as the cliffhanger and we'll get in that on another episode.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, did you want to touch on anything else about your story? And thanks again for telling that.
I mean, I do have some other like more paranormal stuff that kind of links into another thing that we could possibly do a show about at some point, which was like me having all these like sleep paralysis and astral projection experiences when I was a kid. So, I mean, even kind of tying stuff back in, that there is an aspect of Northville that falls into like that portion of my experiences. So that could be another one that I can reconnect back into Northville and come full circle a little bit with that one next time too. So there you go. There's two opportunities for two more things we could dive into on two new shows.
Okay, that's awesome, man. Um, we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. Shane, thanks again for coming on and tell everybody where they can find you.
So, considering that I do two podcasts, Inquiries of Our Reality is my solo show that's very interview based, covering any fringe topic from, spirituality to conspiracies to geopolitics to Sasquatch and cryptids to UFOs to pretty much anything that's open minded as a whole. And then my other show is Bizarre Encounters, which is primarily focusing on paranormal cryptids, UFOs, which I do with my co-host Oren. So that's a little bit more deep dive style, but we do have some interviews mixed in. And on top of that, I also have a show called Bizarre Inquiries that Oren and I do. It was like a short form show, but that's about to be becoming a live 1 hour Patreon monthly show, or not Patreon, YouTube monthly show. So if anybody wants to check out all three of the different projects that I'm working on top of another big project that's coming out going to be starting to be worked on in spring with Riley from Midwest Mythos, which we'll give more information on that as we get closer because we don't want anybody to try to beat us to the punch on that one. But yeah, if you guys want to check out all the different stuff I'm working on, all the different stuff that I do, you guys can go and check out Open Minds Media, which is my like production company that I kind of put everything under to make it quick and easy. But if you guys want to check that out, go and check out http:// the normal internet shit. LANKTR.ee/open_minds_media, and you guys will be able to find all the stuff that I work on all under that one web link and tab.
All right. Thanks again. I'll put all your stuff in the description below. And as always, break the mold, conquer the realm, and thanks for listening.